Chapter 5. William Blake. Everything that lives is holy. One of the strange figures of English literature is William Blake, November the 28th, 1775 to August the 12th, 1827. Blake was both an appealing figure and a repulsive one. A devout Anglican in his love of the old order, and also a Gnostic, for a time a Swedenborgian and a parlour revolutionist. Like Swedenborg, who saw esoteric meanings in the Bible no one else could imagine, Blake saw esoteric meanings in everything. Blake was almost childish in his glee over every hidden and convoluted meaning advocated by heretics old and new. There seem also to be evidences of beliefs later formalised by the British Israel or identity movement. As for Blake, the Bible's prophecies were fulfilled in the British people and state. There are intentional levels of meaning in Blake, but often there is an obvious and militant one. A work of great importance as revelatory of a development in the mind of the modern age is Blake's The Marriage of Heaven and Hell, 1793. It was written at the time of the French Revolution, and its primary meaning reflects the fact. Blake's mind was like a net that caught all the currents and drifting mental debris of his age. A key concept appears almost at once, and its statement is following a declaration that, quote, "A new heaven is begun," end quote. Quote, "Without contraries is no progression, attraction and repulsion, reason and energy, love and hate are necessary to human existence. From these contraries spring what the religious call good and evil. Good is the passive that obeys reason. Evil is the active springing from energy. Good is heaven. Evil is hell." End quote. It is apparent from this that what Hegel formulated was very much in the intellectual atmosphere in Blake's day. Hegel's thesis, antithesis, synthesis system has its analogue in Blake's contraries. Moreover, to assume that Blake saw either contraries as bad or heaven and hell as good and evil in the Christian sense would be very wrong. Long before Nietzsche, we have in Blake the transvaluation of all values. We will misunderstand Blake if we assume that he used language as we do. Blake read black, where we read white. Blake's quote-unquote God rarely appears in his writings. He is simply being. Secondary powers, as in Gnosticism, are the forces that count. His is a pantheistic world in which demiurges rule. Blake's Christian hangover makes him more ready to see sin as a reality, but his Gnosticism leads him to see historical events rather than the Bible as revelation. The French Revolution was thus for him a great event in the spiritual world, more important than any biblical event, it would seem. The Christian virtues are replaced by Blake with pride and sensuality. Blake's hostility to popular Christianity was not in the name of a clear-cut biblical faith, but in terms of a contempt for those lacking in this secret knowledge. Blake used a variety of occult traditions without giving clear allegiance to any. He was his own prophet and religion. He gloried in his isolation and stressed it. He sought profundity in obscurity. In his drawings, his lines are clean and hard, whereas in his mystical writings, clear, sharp knowledge gives way to blurred meanings. At near the beginning of The Marriage of Heaven and Hell, Blake not only declares that, quote, "A new heaven is begun," but that, quote, "the eternal hell revives," end quote. We have here his contraries, so that Edom now has dominion, and we have, quote, "the return of Adam into paradise," end quote. Then Blake gives us a section on, quote, "the voice of the devil," end quote. He cites certain opinions as false, in particular the doctrine of bipartite man, that is, man as body and soul. Many would agree with this meaning without realizing that Blake's purpose is to unite man's being in, quote, energy, which is eternal delight, meaning sexual desire. Restraint of desire is satanic in appearance, but it is in reality otherwise. For Blake, both Christ and Satan champion desire, and in fact the Comforter or Holy Spirit is desire. Blake cites some of his, quote, proverbs of hell, end quote, aphorisms designed to further a Gnostic self-fulfillment in direct violation of moral considerations. Some of the proverbs are, quote, drive your carts and your plough over the bones of the dead. The road of excess leads to the palace of wisdom. Prudence is a rich, ugly old maid courted by incapacity. If the fool would persist in his folly, he would become wise. Prisons are built with stones of law, brothels with bricks of religion. The lust of the goat is the bounty of God. Exuberance is beauty. Sooner murder an infant in its cradle than nurse unacted desires. End quote. These are clearly expressive of the romantic mood. Virtue meant for the Romantics exuberance, and vice was unacted desire. Blake then goes further, quote, all deities reside in the human breast, end quote. He then gives us, quote, a memorable fancy, end quote, the prophets Isaiah and Ezekiel dining with Blake. Blake states that Isaiah told him, with respect to his visions, quote, I saw no God, nor heard any in a finite organical perception, but my senses discovered the infinite in everything, and as I was then persuaded and remain confirmed, that the voice of honest indignation is the voice of God, I cared not for consequences, but wrote, end quote. Then asked, does a firm persuasion that a thing is so make it so? He replied, all poets believe that it does, and in ages of imagination, this firm persuasion removed mountains, but many are not capable of a firm persuasion of anything. End quote. The occult romantic imagination creates reality. We have here before Hegel his doctrine that the rational is the real. What man's mind intelligently and clearly conceives is thereby the real. Because of this, man's, quote, honest indignation is the voice of God, end quote. We can understand from this why the Romantics saw themselves as true prophets. Their intense convictions and strong indignations were ipso facto truth. This, quote, memorable fancy, end quote, is preceded by a statement that gives the rationale for this view, quote, the ancient poets animated all sensible objects with gods or geniuses, calling them by the names and adorning them with the properties of woods, rivers, mountains, lakes, cities, nations, and whatever their large and numerous senses could perceive. And particularly, they studied the genius of each city and country, placing it under its mental deity, till a system was formed which took some advantage of and enslaved the vulgar by attempting to realize or abstract the mental deities from their objects. Thus began priesthood, choosing forms of worship from poetic tales. And at length they pronounced that the gods had ordered such things. Thus men forget that all deities reside in the human breast. End quote. This tells us how old the modern view of the birth of religions is. The beginnings of occultism is that plenary power resides within the universe, not beyond it. This means that man must see this world and this life as complete without reference to anything beyond it. The way back to the Garden of Eden, man's true innocence, is to transcend good and evil. Before Nietzsche, Blake insisted on the transvaluation of all values. Using the biblical scheme in a radically different way, Blake wrote, quote, The ancient tradition that the world will be consumed in fire at the end of 6,000 years is true, as I have heard from hell. For the cherub with the flaming sword is hereby commanded to leave his guard at the tree of life, and when he does, the whole creation will be consumed and appear infinite and holy, whereas it now appears finite and corrupt. This will come to pass by an improvement of sensual enjoyment." End quote. The thesis of the, quote, "sexual revolution," end quote, of the 1960s was that mankind would be regenerated and energized by a total, quote-unquote, freedom for all kinds of sexuality. This, quote-unquote, revolution was an end product of Romanticism. The Romantic vision sees absolute freedom from restraint as the gateway to paradise. For Blake, his wife was a bar to his freedom to try polygamy. Blake's thesis was this, quote, "God only acts and is in existing beings or men," end quote. He held, quote, "I have also the Bible of hell, which the world shall have whether they will or no," end quote. At the end of The Marriage of Heaven and Hell, Blake gives us, quote, "a song of liberty," end quote. Its theme is the coming destruction and annihilation of all law. The cleansing fires of man's inherent passions and desire will, when given freedom, make man a free creature in the new paradise. No more, Blake declared, let, quote, "pale religious lechery call that virginity that wishes but acts not," end quote. By Blake's logic, one should be virtuous by murdering rather than suppressing the urge to kill. Quote, "The sons of joy," end quote, "are the champions of unrestricted freedom." Since the gods, or God, and heaven and hell are alike creations of man's mind, for man to oppose anything to his desire is evil. His mind must be reconciled to his body, to his desires and lusts, because only so can he be a whole man. Since all things have their origin in man, for man to oppose one aspect of his thinking or feeling to another is to torment himself. Since heaven and hell are alike his creation, projections of his imagination, he must unite them to be a whole man. Thus, he cannot oppose good to evil, morality to actions that are lawless, nor reason to passion. Important also in this connection is Blake's "There is no natural religion," circa 1788. Orthodox Christianity cannot accept natural religion because nature is fallen, and the fallen man's religion is closest to that of the Marquis de Sade. Paul, in Romans 1, tells us that fallen man holds down the truth because of his unrighteousness or injustice. He prefers a religion in his own image. His, quote, "natural religion," end quote, is summed up in Genesis 3:5, his desire to be his own God and to know or establish his own doctrine of good and evil, law and morality. The Enlightenment concept of natural religion was of a Christianity without Christ and with a deistic God. It was a step towards a full departure from biblical faith. Blake's objection to natural religion was the antithesis of the Christian one. His quote-unquote argument was, quote, "Man has no notion of moral fitness but from education. Naturally, he is only a natural organ subject to sense." End quote. St. Paul is bypassed. Man is a product of nature whose only knowledge comes from his senses. Apart from education, he would have no knowledge of good and evil, nor a conscience. His religious and moral ideas are simply products of his education. Blake held, quote, "Man's desires are limited by his perceptions. None can desire what he has not perceived." End quote. All ideas, apart from education otherwise, are only empirically derived. This means that religion and morality, being aspects of education, are an imposition on the natural man, whether in Christian form or as man's natural religion. The infinite is God, and God, quote, "becomes as we are, that we may be as he is." End quote. We, when we see God as the infinite in all things, see God and become a part of Him. Quote, all religions are one, end quote, because, quote, the religions of all nations are derived from each nation's different reception of the poetic genius, which is everywhere called the spirit of prophecy, end quote. Because man is the source of all religions, they are essentially one. Quote, the true man is the source, he being the poetic genius, end quote. After Kant and Hegel, Blake saw the world as a product of his reason or his imagination. He thus conversed with angels like Swedenborg and naturally was not contradicted by any of his own creations. In fact, he was marvellously supported. Only Mrs. Blake, who, despite his efforts, was not his creature, ever contradicted him. At the end of The Marriage of Heaven and Hell, there is a conclusion in 7 words, quote, for everything that lives is holy, end quote. That sentence became, in the hands of Allen Ginsberg, a standard in the 1960s for the sexual revolution. It became a justification for every kind of sexual practice. Blake's sentence was not perverted. What Blake did not do, the sexual revolutionaries openly practiced. If, quote, everything that lives is holy, end quote, then there is no need for law, because the concern of law is good and evil. The unholy and anti-holy is dealt with by law. If things as they are, the status quo in every realm, are holy, then the only problem is the person, such as the Christian, who insists that the world is fallen and evil, and, instead of affirming the status quo, God's law order must be upheld and extended. The humanistic revolutionaries, given their logic, can only war against Christianity for affirming God's law, because the status quo of a fallen world is their definition of good. Logically, given their evolutionary faith, they should say that man need not have evolved out of the primeval slime because it was in itself holy and beyond good and evil. Indeed, logically, they should declare themselves content to return to the previous nothingness. No criterion can stand before their relativism. The late Lenny Bruce was a champion of this anti-law relativistic position. He declared, quote, the religious leaders are what should be. Let me tell you the truth. The truth is what is. If what is, you have to sleep at night 10 hours a day. That's the truth. A lie will be, people need no sleep at all. Truth is what is, end quote. William Blake was a militant antinomian. His hostility at times to the churches and to Christians was due to the fact that the churches then still affirmed theonomy, the rule of God's law. Blake, in, quote, The Everlasting Gospel, end quote, circa 1818, gives us his version of the woman taken in adultery being brought to Jesus for judgment. Quote, Jesus was sitting in Moses' chair. They brought the trembling woman there. Moses commands she be stoned to death. What was the sound of Jesus' breath? He laid his hands on Moses' law, the ancient heavens in silent awe, writ with curses from pole to pole, all away began to roll. The earth trembling and naked lay, in secret bed of mortal clay. On Sinai felt the hand divine, putting back the bloody shrine, and she heard the breath of God, as she heard by Eden's flood. Good and evil are no more. Sinai's trumpets cease to roar. Come, finger of God, to write. The heavens are not clean in thy sight. Thou art God, and thou alone, nor may the sinner cast one stone. To be good only is to be a god, or else a Pharisee. Thou angel of the presence divine, thou didst create this body of mine. Wherefore hast thou writ these laws, and created hell's dark jaws? My presence I will take from thee. A cold leper thou shalt be. End quote. Not only does Blake use the name of Jesus to affirm that all things are holy, he insists that, quote, To be good only is to be God or else a Pharisee." End quote. This does not say much for his view of God, who is equated with a Pharisee. Even more, Blake, having rendered relative the ideas of good and evil, tells us men need to be both good and evil. The truly holy life means one that freely and happily affirms and practices all things. It means living beyond the old definitions of good and evil by affirming both to be a part of life. Heaven and hell are married. Men can feel free to practice those things which were once regarded as evil, depraved and hellish, because no real line of division separates good and evil. For Blake, this meant no more perhaps than wanting a loving relationship with another woman while loving his wife. His philosophy, however, had no such limitation. Others pursued the doctrine to radical conclusions. In the late 1930s and into the 1940s, I knew a seminary professor who had fought vigorously for a, quote, liberal, end quote, view of the Bible. He wanted a limited skepticism concerning the Bible, but not about the supernatural Jesus. When his successors reduced Jesus to a natural man and eliminated all traces of supernaturalism as mythical, he was shocked and outraged. He failed to recognize that men cannot set eternal and binding landmarks and boundaries. Only God can. Having substituted his boundary for God's, he was appalled that men were transgressing it. Churchmen after Blake have repeated this pattern. By denying the permanent validity of God's law, they broke the human limitation God had ordained. Antinomianism took command of the churches, and there was no bulwark against the flood of moral relativism that followed. If modernism is justified, why not Blake also, and Lenny Bruce, Hugh Hefner and others? How can our affirmations of what is good and what is evil survive if we deny God's law? If God has no boundaries, how can man have them? If good and evil are both relative concepts, not eternal verities, then man is the absolute. This is then, and has been, the logical conclusion. Every man his own law and his own world.